You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
So, Dave, one of our listeners, Gavin Crowley, has been in touch from Cork, who says there's a lot of action on TikTok about the notion that an artist doesn't become a household name until they have very recognisable hair. This is an old theory of ours, isn't it? That hair is 80% of pop music.
Hair is definitely 80% of pop music. I was only going to offer one kind of contradiction, which is the biggest star in world popular music nowadays is Taylor Swift, who I would argue doesn't seem to me to have that recognisable hair. Am I completely wrong?
No, I think you're wrong.
Am I?
I think you're wrong.
Are young women adopting Taylor's
shorter hair? No, I think the long hair is a big part of the whole concept, actually.
But are young women deliberately making their hair behave in the way that Taylor Swift's behaving?
No, I mean, she hasn't got a recognisable Taylor Swift hairstyle, particularly. Okay. She's just got long hair, hasn't she? But I think it's interesting, as I've mentioned to you many times, that time I interviewed Rod Stewart and said, how long are you going to keep doing it? And this was in, whatever it was, 1986, I think. He said, as long as I've got the barnet. And it's just such a crucial part of it, isn't it?
It is so crucial. And only yesterday I was telling somebody about when I bumped into Rod Stewart at a funeral quite recently.
Yeah.
And that is the thing, that when you're suddenly confronted by Rod Stewart in person, you get you're startled, pretty much as if you've opened a cupboard and it's full of spitting image puppets, you know what I mean? And what makes him so characteristic is entirely the kind of penumbra of hair, you know what I mean? It's that shape that goes out from his head, you know, and that's been his look since, well, when? 1968, 69?
68, exactly.
Something like
that. But
isn't
it the case that if you think of most pop stars, the first thing you're thinking of is hair? It just is, you know. Sex Pistols, George Michael, Stray Cats, Joni Mitchell, Lenny Kravitz.
Joni Mitchell, I'm just gonna add a few questions here. Didn't Joni Mitchell go through a stage where she restyled her hair and she didn't look like Joni Mitchell anymore? I can't exactly remember when it was, but it might have been in the 90s or whatever. She went in for slightly shorter hair. And suddenly you thought, Joni, you don't look. Of course, it was the frizz. It was the frizz. Joni Mitchell's frizz stage. And you suddenly thought, Joni, you don't look like Joni Mitchell anymore. Actually, it reminds me old joke when Barbra Streisand first became famous in the United States in, I suppose, 1966, 67, something like that. And there was a story that if a woman went into a salon and said, I'd like the Barbra Streisand look, the hairdresser would pick up the brush and hit her across the nose with it.
Oh, no.
Very old joke.
Oh, that's very wrong.
Oh, okay. It's a very old joke because the idea that Barbra Streisand's protuberant nose was actually part of a look rather than the sleek haircut. Yeah, it has always been about hair. And if you go back and look through all the newspaper accounts of the arrival of everybody from Elvis Presley, certainly the Beatles, certainly the Rolling Stones, certainly the Sex Pistols, and so forth, the newspaper accounts are 80% about the hair. They're not about the music at all. It's the hair that causes the kind of the shock, and it's the hair that everybody can instantly and effectively imitate. You don't have to have a record or anything like that. You don't have to sing the songs or anything.
Yeah, you don't have to go out and buy an expensive bit of kit to wear.
You don't. I mean, there's the classic cases. Obviously, the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan in February 1964. Whole of America the following few days. School assemblies all over America were interrupted by principals having to exclude people or announce what were now the rules on what they could do with their hair. That was the way that the Beatles' invasion of the United States manifested itself. It wasn't through buying records. It was through hair, Because also young people have it, don't they? So they can play with it. They can make the most of it. Go on.
No, it struck me that also that most pop stars' careers took off after a major change in a hairstyle. And actually, when you start thinking about it, it's probably true of virtually all of them. You think of the Beatles and the Byrds, Police are really good examples when they all had their hair dyed. Blondie, that whole idea that she got that hairstyle and the group was kind of named after it, Eurythmics, Culture Club, even the Grateful Dead, when they stopped being a jug band and became a kind of hippie band. And that was the moment, wasn't it? All metal acts, all punk acts. And ultimately you start thinking, well, it's pretty much everybody. That's the major change that they make that gets them some kind of attention.
David Bowie did it twice, didn't he? Well, he did it more than twice. But, the kind of Veronica Lake curtain of hair around about hunky-dory, and then the kind of orange lollipop, which we were discussing with Susie Ronson recently. And then he's kind of later, kind of Germanic cuts, and so he did it. He did it many times. But you're absolutely right. And of course, the one you've mentioned, which is so much a part of what this person is all about that you almost just forget it, is Blondie. It is, as you say, it's Debbie Harry. It's reaching for a kind of glamorous look that deliberately wasn't completed. Because the thing about Blondie was that you could see her roots, wasn't it? That was the kind of punk bit of it. That I've done this in a sort of half-hearted slightly satirical fashion, you know what I mean? It hasn't been done expensively. It hasn't been done by the world's greatest and most expensive hairdressers. It's been done by my mate in a bedroom or whatever.
That's right.
With a kit or something. It wasn't like that, clearly. But that was kind of the impression it was intended to give.
I've got an old album of hers when she was in The Wind in the Willows, and she's on the front of that, and she's just got long, kind of lightish brown hair, really. And she looks absolutely fantastic, but she doesn't in any way stand out and have that kind of identity. It's completely transformational.
It is extraordinary, actually, when you think back. And the couple of years when Debbie Harry was just the biggest thing. So when are we talking about? I don't know, very
79?
early 80s, 79, 80. Okay.
Yeah.
And that was, everybody wanted Debbie Harry on the cover of absolutely everything, from smash hits to Vogue to the Sunday Times magazine to I don't know what. And the amazing thing is, when you kind of look at her now, I mean, she was photogenic, wasn't she? Rather than dazzlingly beautiful. People came along later who were dazzlingly beautiful and really polished and really toned and so forth. She was just fabulously photogenic, wasn't she? You couldn't take your eyes off her.
There was no bad picture of her. She just looked, she was charismatic, characterful.
Yeah.
Amazing repertoire of facial expression. She was absolutely brilliant.
And also one of those people who look brilliant on a small screen. Mick Jagger looked brilliant on a small screen, looking out at the camera on I don't know, the Kenny Everett video show or Top of the Pops or whatever. She just projected something that nobody else had done.
Yeah.
And hair was a huge part of that, definitely.
I keep thinking of people, like Grace Jones, Tina Turner, Nico, Slash, Greg Allman, Billie Eilish. There's people, the first thing you think of is their hair. But it struck me that there must be several key looks, do you think? Key hairstyles. The Elvis quiff, or in fact, Little Richard, actually. Little Richard's pompadour back in the day must have been one of the most shocking things imaginable.
It was, and still kind of is. Although the interesting thing about the Elvis thing is the Elvis look was actually the Tony Curtis look, wasn't it? Because that's what Elvis wanted to look like. He wanted to look like Tony Curtis, And of course, as we've mentioned on this pod in the past, the great irony of Elvis is he didn't have black hair.
That's right.
It was kind of blondish. It was dyed black to get that Tony Curtis kind of dramatic greaser look that he wanted. But yes, that the Tony Curtis look as adopted by Elvis became became the one, didn't it? And of course, the other thing is when you watch any of the TV programs from the 50s where they had a character who was supposed to be like Elvis, like there was an episode of the Bilko show where they had a new recruit called Elvin Pelvin, you know.
Oh, I remember.
Everybody had something like that. And of course, what the character had to do was the thing that many years later, Henry Winkler had to do as the Fonz, which was not just have the hair, but also be seen to be combing it all the time. You know what I mean? That was the pose, wasn't it? They always had a comb in their right hand. And, if there was any slack moment, they would just streak it back, wouldn't they? Put it in place. That
was the thing Teds did all the time, didn't they?
That's what I mean. It's part of the Ted pose, that you combed your hair all the time.
Maintaining.
Yeah. It's a very post-war thing, that suddenly hair oil was available. I suppose it come off the ration. And so you could lard your hair with even more of this kind of stuff. No, it's amazing. It's,
the mop top.
Go on, yeah.
We must mention the mop top, surely. Absolutely, the Beatles' Birds look, I mean, just absolutely staggering. The idea of hair in motion, wasn't it? You were talking about it before, not moving, and suddenly it was moving. And you can see that right through into Oasis and the Stone Roses. And I think Jimi Hendrix' experience in the Afro was an amazing thing as well. Don't you think a lot of people are adopting a kind of black hairstyle? Beehives?
It's funny, we were talking about Eric Clapton and John Mayall's Blues Breakers only the other day. And it's quite interesting. So 1966 is the year that Blues Breakers comes out. And by the time it comes out, Eric Clapton's kind of left and is about to join Cream. Yeah. And so if you look at him in Blues Breakers, he's got the kind of Wyatt Earp sideburns, hasn't he? He's very much like a Western character. But then when he gets into Cream, it's gone frizzy, hasn't it? You know what I mean? Yeah. When he appears in Cream, because Jimi Hendrix has arrived by then. Yeah. And so, the look becomes the frizzy perm and so forth. And if you look at Eric Clapton throughout the 60s, from sort of 1963 through to 1970, his hair does not remain the same for longer than for 3 months at any point in that period. Whereas nowadays, you look at, you mentioned Oasis. Oasis adopts the kind of Birds, Beatles, mop. Yes. They've adopted that hairstyle for 30 years, have not changed it, have they?
They haven't changed it once.
Haven't changed it one bit. And that's absolutely amusing because people used to change their hair absolutely all the time.
I can remember doing a piece about, one about Keith Richards too, but one about Keith Richards and one about Eric Clapton. They're changing hairstyles in one of the magazines I was on. I think it was Select, And just as you say, just running a picture from every few months. And it was really fantastic. So interesting. I can remember all of them at the time. I remember how exciting it was. And that Keith Richards look, I think, is just, if you were to look at a rock star emoji or a cartoon, someone to draw a cartoon of a rock star, that would be the haircut, don't you think?
The haircut that he had,
Smith, Jeff Beck.
There's the one he had on the cover of Rolling Stone in 1971 when they did the Keith Richards interview, which is very much the beginning of the cult of Keith. Starts there at that point. Yeah. And I think the hair was kind of, if not self-administered, was done by Anita Pallenberg. It was kind of incomplete, unbalanced hairstyle. But that was the one. And that was the one that Patti Smith took a picture of and said, I want my... Patti Smith based her whole career on, I'm going to look like Keith Richards on the cover of Rolling Stone in 1971, and then I will make records that sound like they were made by somebody who looked like Keith Richards on the cover of Rolling Stone in 1971. Mind you, she's changed her hair, hasn't she? She has. She looks like a kind of a character of Game of Thrones now, doesn't she? It's extraordinary mane of hair. So she's abandoned the old look. Unlike Oasis, who have who have stuck to it. Although, which just gives me more force to our argument, as I think we were saying the other week, are Oasis the most conservative concept in the history of popular music?
The Word Podcast, prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
We were both looking at this story about the remaking of old movies, which is the massive currency in Hollywood, increasingly so apparently with every year. And as far as I can see, these are some of the following movies that are now being remade. And you've probably got more that I've missed, actually. American Werewolf in London, The Birds, Clueless technically also obviously a remake of Jane Austen's Emma, Das Boot, which is a really good idea. That's a great idea, because it's not a film that depends particularly on the characters. It's just entirely about the story, and technology would make that even more agonizing. Friday the 13th, Invasion of the Bodysnatchers, Thomas Crown Affair, Don't Look Now, Nightmare on Elm Street, Nosferatu, and Sister Act. You got any more?
Are they making Thomas Crown Affair again? Because they remade that about 10 years ago with Pierce Brosnan, wasn't it? They've obviously done it again. Oh, there's millions. There's endless Batman remakes. Escape from New York, Fantastic Four, Drop Dead Fred, Roadhouse, How to Train Your Dragon, Beetlejuice 2, more Ghostbusters, more Indiana Jones. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And I don't know if it just speaks of the kind of desperation of Hollywood, that they're just desperate to get people back in the cinemas, and they think they're more likely to do that with a known quantity than trying to sell people on the idea of a new film. And I suppose they maybe feel that they've abdicated original drama to streaming television, in that people are more likely to pick up on a Breaking Bad or a Wire or any of those things if it's brought to you via streaming television. Yeah. And what they're trying to do is something different. The thing that it made me wonder about is when you have one part of the international entertainment business relying so heavily on the rebooting of what they call old IP, why doesn't the same thing happen in music? And it sort of doesn't really, does it? And I was trying to think of examples. There are rare examples. Like they did remake Bat Out of Hell, didn't they? If I recall rightly, which if Bat Out of Hell did kind of behave like a movie. It was a story that had a plot and a character and so forth. But nobody's redone Dark Side of the Moon or OK Computer or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band or anything like that. Or have they? Maybe
Roger Waters he redid Dark Side of the Moon, I think, didn't he? Didn't he do his own version of it not long ago?
Yes, that's true. They did something.
I think he did. But no, I think you're absolutely right. There's people have remade albums in order to own the copyright. There's the Taylor Swift versions. Yeah. Squeeze did that album, didn't they, called Spot the Difference or whatever, because they just wanted people to play and to use that version of it so they would make more money out of it. Fair enough, And people have toured classic albums. I remember going to see Kraftwerk and they would do a different album every night. But I don't, and there's tribute albums. Obviously, people have done whole tribute versions of Sgt. Pepper or whatever, but that's not the same thing. So what you're saying is, should Blur go back and remake Modern Life is Rubbish 30 years after putting it out? Is that what you're saying? Why aren't people redoing?
Or should somebody else, I suppose, because that's basically what happens in the Hollywood. The Hollywood template of a reboot is, okay, we take a familiar old story, film that everybody's seen and everybody loves, and then we do it again, and we take advantage of the presumed leaps forward in technology that have taken place between the original one and the new one, and we put some new, sexy new young stars in the lead roles, and then we bring back the venerable actors who starred in the original to play older versions of themselves. You know what I mean? Harrison Ford, I don't know what. That's kind of the way it's done, isn't it? And then everybody gaily skips down to the cinema, anticipating that perfect combination of a thing with which they're utterly familiar, in which there will be no surprises, nothing jarring at all, but they will have the supreme reassurance that everybody seeks, which is more money will have been spent on it than will have been spent on in the past. Therefore, the bangs will be bigger. You know what I mean? The nudity will be greater. The language will be saltier. You know, that's basically what it. Nobody does a reboot and does a restrained kind of reworking of the original thing, do they? They don't do that. They go further out. It's always a cost
bigger,
louder, you know, faster, more colourful, you know, more gags per second. Nothing will be asked of you. If you get, that's the promise. It ought to be the line that they use, you know, to promote any of these things. Come and see this. It really won't be hard at all. You know what I mean? That's the kind of promise, isn't it? Well, you sort of, can you do that with music? I don't know if you can, really.
I don't think you can, though.
I don't think nobody sits and listens to, I mean, this is a hoary old example. It's 50 years old. But, you know, nobody listens to Dark Side of the Moon and thinks, well, if you did it again tomorrow, there's a lot of things you could do that you couldn't do in 1974.
No, and also, who would you want to do it again? That's the thing. Are you talking about anybody who was involved, or you like a completely new set of people?
A combination of the two would be the classic, and to apply the Hollywood template. That's what you would do. You would find a kind of young band, but you'd also have Roger Waters involved in some shape or form, you know. But I don't get the feeling there's any public appetite for this whatsoever.
No, I don't think there is.
Because if you want Dark Side of the Moon, or OK Computer, or Blur's first album, or name what you will, it's there. There it is. You know what I mean? It's not the case.
What would you be seeking to improve, though? What would be the point of it, do you think?
Well, nobody, let's be clear about this. Nobody doing a reboot of a Hollywood blockbuster is seeking to improve anything. They're all just seeking to make more money out of something that's familiar by applying more technology and more budget to it and charging. And here's the key point. When you bought a ticket for Star Wars or Jaws or whatever in the 70s, how much were you paying? You know, what is that? 40p? Probably not even that. How much are you paying if you go see the reboot? £15, thank you very much. Yeah. That's basically how it works, you know. You're selling the same thing for more money in the present.
But isn't there something about the album that's sort of sacrosanct? It's a bit like that whole idea of books being republished with different covers, but nobody in a million years would ever put out an album with anything but the original album cover, because the album cover is such a big part of that package. And do you think there's a connection? Because I think there might be. It's like Pet Sounds is genuinely considered to be one of the worst album sleeves ever, but if they reissued Pet Sounds with a different album sleeve, you'd be mortified and scandalized.
There is that, although it is interesting. The people have had quite a bit of success of writing Ian Fleming James Bond novels, you know, that he never wrote. You know, keeping those characters going. They've had some success doing that, haven't they? And I think that applies with with many other fictional characters. But there's just something about a record. You can't do that. Because a record is a record of a particular time that magically, and here's the extraordinary thing about popular music, as opposed to movies, as opposed to television, as opposed to even fiction, it doesn't date. Because nobody listens to whatever it is, I don't know, you know, Achtung Baby or Like a Virgin or whatever, and just think, it sounds a bit dated. They don't. They just instantly, if they like it at all, they just think that's classic. It's above petty considerations of when it was done and the world that it sprang from. It floats above all that stuff, which, you know, accounts for our whole kind of musical culture, you know, that music used to be, and this is the big switch that's taken place over the last 30 years, I suppose. You know, the hottest thing in music used to be the newest thing. It's not anymore. The hottest thing is the kind of classic thing.
It's the oldest thing.
It's not. The oldest thing, maybe 10 years old, maybe 40
not
years
oldest,
old.
But yeah, it's the thing in the past. It doesn't
matter. But it's sort of, it kind of belongs, it's above all that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
And
so are you saying that records don't ever sound dated then? Because we were talking the other day, weren't we, about if you hear something with a sin drum on it.
There are exceptions, but I think broadly speaking, you know, when I wrote my book about 1971, you know, one of the points I was making is if you go and sit down and watch the films of 1971, you have to kind of make adjustments. You think, oh, obviously this world's disappeared and so forth, and we don't do things like that anymore and all this. Whereas if you go and listen to, I don't know, Sweet Baby James or Joni Mitchell's Blue or Rod Stewart's Every Picture's All Tell the Story of any other records that came out in 1971, you don't have to make any adjustment at all. You know, they sound, you put those records down next to records that those same people made years later, and the 1971 ones sound slightly better, actually, because. But
you're talking about the sound of them. You're not talking the lyrics. The lyrics can change, can't they? I mean,
they can change.
You can't argue that Brown Sugar sounds kind of different now than it did then.
No, but you can strongly argue that they never improved on that kind of on the technology at that time. You know, you could spend more money, but you wouldn't actually hear any benefit. So I think the more important point is that the hottest thing used to be the new thing. And I think it's been a long time since the hottest thing has been the new thing, you know.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that new things can't be hot. Obviously they can, you know. But the days when everybody had to know what it was that was a number one have kind of gone, you know. And I don't know if they're ever to return.
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
There was a little piece the other day, I think it was in The Guardian, about the CD boom. And it just made a really good point, I think, that for, teenagers in the 1980s, 78s were something for your grandparents. Vinyl was the format that your parents probably really liked. Cassettes was for elder brothers and sisters. But CD was your format. That was the format that belonged to your generation, which I thought was interesting because the person who wrote this piece was really, really nostalgic about how wonderful CDs were. But it's quite hard for anybody our age to look back at CDs with that kind of nostalgia and that kind of fondness, because we all thought of them as we were promised that these things were going to be indestructible, and when they weren't, they just seemed fiddly and annoying and small and reduced and with hinges that broke and stuff. Do you ever feel nostalgic about the compact disc?
No, I don't feel nostalgic about the compact disc, but I do recognize its utility. And I've always thought that in some way it will make a comeback because it's there and we understand it, and many of us have got a machine that still plays it, although declining number of cars have got CD players. And that was where most people used to listen to CD. And I thought, if you're going to have one accepted carrier of music, you're better off with CD than anything else, actually, because, although nothing's indestructible, it's more it's easier to preserve than vinyl and so forth. What I think is interesting is that, and it's nothing to do with CD itself, just like I think the vinyl fetish is nothing to do with the vinyl. I think it's all to do with the package and the package that has the greatest appeal to our souls, and the package over which we're most nostalgic is the cardboard package of the 12-inch LP. And so, as we've said before, 50% of people who buy 12-inch LPs in this day and age do not have any machine to play them on at all. You know, they are completely...
They're just beautiful objects.
They're beautiful objects which perfectly symbolize their feeling about music and perfectly advertise their association with music. And they do it in a way that the CD package can never do. Because the CD package is an unlovely thing. You know, it's too small. It's hidden behind perspex. It is, as you said, as you observed, Mark, it breaks all those kind of things. You know, I do these Instagram reels where I just talk very briefly about one record, one album, and it. You know, what I've done so far is all 12-inch LPs. And
it's funny, I watched those, and they're really good, and I just think they wouldn't work with a CD.
Well, it's interesting. At some point, I'm going to have to try it with a CD. But you hold up a 12-inch record. You hold up, I've done this at, you know, literature festivals or whatever. You hold up a 12-inch record in front of a room full of people, and everybody just sits up. Everybody looks over, they crane their necks over other people's shoulders. And you can hear the room go,
yeah.
Nobody does that about CD. Nobody does that about cassette at all. It's the strange magic of that size, that format, that odd thing that happened when it was invented, you know. And it was invented slowly. It was starting in 1948, but, you know, didn't really come to its prime until the late 50s. That's the that's the focus of all our consumer desires. It's become a symbol of that. It's become a symbol for people of, you hold up an LP in front of a load of people, and people seem to think, oh, that's when the world was perfect. You know what I mean? It was.
We were happy then.
We were happy then. I can't think of anything else that people feel like that about, you know. I can't think of any other objects that they feel like that about, you know. They just approve of it.
But it's a tactile thing, isn't it? It's going back to actually physically holding that record when you were 15 or whatever. And,
I suppose.
And remembering
when you were 15, you could never have enough of them. You see, people don't feel the same thing about books. You know, although people approve of books, you hold up books in front of people, they don't have the same feeling.
No, that's true.
Something about records, it's a really odd thing. And so, you know, you can have all the kind of the utility of music carriers, and they have all their own arguments, you know, cassettes, CDs, online, whatever. But the kind of soul appeal of records is all in 12-inch LPs. Because the interesting thing is, nobody who's bothered about album covers is remotely bothered about 7-inch 45s.
No.
They don't go around doing that about 7-inch 45s.
But I wonder if that point you made about books is because books are an entirely solo pursuit, aren't they?
Possibly,
books is not a common thing. When you read a book, all you're remembering is you sitting in a deck chair in 1978 reading that book. Whereas if you see a record, the one thing I'm always reminded of is the people I heard that record with, and a time and a place and a particular community of friends, and you're just linked to something much bigger than the actual experience of listening to it, aren't you?
Yeah, but there is also I think I wrote a bit about this in my book. I'm going to plug my book, A Fabulous Creation.
Plug away.
Which is about the kind of culture of the LP. And I quoted Jackson Browne in there. And Jackson Browne, famously with his first solo album, he just wanted something that kind of looked like one of those water bottles, that Hessian water bottles that people used to fill it with water and then place on the radiator of their car before they went into the Mojave Desert, where it was going to get very warm and your car was going to overheat. He just had an idea about doing it like that. And one of the things he said about album covers, because you could get away with doing things like that in album covers, he says the size of them was about the same size, the same area as the shield of a Native American warrior.
Yeah.
So when a Native American warrior reached manhood, he would go off into the desert. And one of the things he'd have to come back with was his idea of what he wanted his symbol to be. Was it going to be, I don't know, an eagle or a rock or, I don't know, the sun or fire or whatever. And this would be devised, and that would be his shield when he went into war. And the size of it was roughly the size of a 12-inch LP, which is roughly the size of
a human head.
It's T-shirt slogan, Mark. That's why people wear T-shirts. It's advertisement. And it relates to, I'm sure kind of if you've gone back into, the heraldry of the medieval and Elizabethan times, it's the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is my shield. This is what represents me. So, it might be 3 lions rampant and I don't know, and a castle or whatever. Or it might be a water bottle to put over your car radiator.
Yeah, exactly.
In the Mojave Desert. It fulfills the same function.
They're very basic, very primitive things.
And so the thing about album covers is nowadays, I don't think it's anything to do with music. It's kind of it's broken loose from music. It's a thing in itself. You know what I mean? If you said to most people, I'll tell you what, I've got a garage full of album covers, fabulous old album covers. They haven't all got the records in, but the album covers are there. Do you want them? They'd want them. People would want those things. They put on the wall,
They'd want them far more than if you just had the record with no sleeve.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Nobody wants the record with no sleeve. Nobody. I've got a few of those. I've got the saddest sight. Oh, Mark, I think about this. You've probably got a few. When I go through
I've got a few in the attic.
I find a kind of. I've got the Rolling Stones Black and Blue. I've got Ry Cooder's. Oh, which one is it? I think it's Into Purple Valley, and a few others. And what I realize is, back in the day, when you and I used to be doing magazines, and very often you had to have these features which had to have illustrations of old album covers. Here's Ry Cooder's best records or whatever, rated and so forth. And in those days, if you wanted the cover, you couldn't just hoik an image off the internet. You had to have somebody in the office who had it. And so that was very often me. And I'd come in and, I'd hand them over to Jonathan or Cowlsey or whatever. And they'd come back from the printers about, a month later. And then I might forget to take one home or somebody, I don't know. And stuff gets lost. And so 30 years later, I'm looking at my copy of Rolling Stones Black and Blue and thinking, where's the bloody cover for that?
But see, without the cover, it doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist.
You can't even, it's no longer the entity it was. It's no longer a record. You no longer even want to play it.
You don't. You hate it. You don't like it anymore. It's let you down because it hasn't got the cover. You know what I mean? Once we had something, it's like the old joke, once we had something complete and perfect, and what happened? You spent it. It's that kind of idea. So, sorry, I don't know how we started talking about CDs and ended up like that, but CDs will never have, what I think they call materiality, which is there are certain things that we find moving as objects.
Yeah.
And CDs, we don't. They have utility, and I wouldn't want them to disappear, and I've got millions of them, and I haven't thrown any away, and so forth. But they have no soul appeal whatsoever.
No, when you open a drawer full of CDs, the heart doesn't kind of suddenly miss a beat, does it? Just think, oh, Lord, no, where's the one I'm looking for? Is the hinge broken?
Nobody comes to your house and says, can I see your CDs?
CDs?
Just doesn't. It all. It's very sad. I spent some time with Bob Harris at his place in Oxfordshire a few years back. And Bob has got a fantastic sort of Nissen hut out in the garden where he keeps all his records, as Bob calls them, records.
He calls them records. Yeah.
And of course, There's hardly any vinyl because he famously lost a load of vinyl I shouldn't laugh.
In a flood, didn't he?
In a flood. Yeah, never live on a floodplain if you got a load of old T-Rex acetates.
No,
kids.
terrible thing.
Don't do that. And but he's got loads.
They'll
of
be excavated in years to come like a Viking boat. People will say, "Crabby Appleton, what the hell was that?"
With the nearest we comes, we think this belonged to a DJ.
That's right. Whatever a DJ was.
Yes, absolutely. But anyway, he talks about the records, but what he's got the CDs, and because the CDs are not the same thing at all, but they do the job, but they don't make the heart sing and never will.
The word podcast. Clearly, there is no plan.
Well, I think we're pretty much there for this week, but we are going to end with our birthday guest. If you are a Patreon supporter, and if you go for the birthday slot, then we will come round digitally and you can show us your record collection on Zoom. And also the next year you can come in as a guest on the podcast with a query, with a conversational log to throw on the fire. And that is exactly what our birthday guest, Patrick Butler, is about to do.
Okay, we're joined by birthday boy Patrick in Boston, or I think, do we say Boston? Is that go on? Go on, tell me the proper way to say Boston, as in Massachusetts.
The proper way to say it is Boston.
Boston.
Boston with a W.
There's an implied W between the B and the A there, isn't there?
There is. The B and the A, the O.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, of course,
Yeah.
Of course. All right, nice to see you. When's the birthday?
The birthday is July the 3rd. So
right, okay.
A few weeks ago. Yep.
Okay, how did you celebrate?
Well, as you guys probably know, the 4th of July is a very, very popular day here. So the day before, we had a lot of people coming on the 4th. So we just went out to dinner with my mother. Right. But it was lovely.
That sounds quiet.
It's a bit like having a birthday on Christmas Eve or something, isn't it?
Yeah. Gets rather overlooked, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So it's traditional on these occasions for our birthday guests to throw a conversational log on the word in your ear bonfire. What have you got?
Well, inspired actually by something you guys were talking about a few weeks back with Taylor Swift. And I think the reference was that the music sounded like the amniotic throb. And I think it was from the Times review. And I started to think about how it seems for me, even I wasn't in the 1960s. I was, born at the end of the 70s. And yet when I hear a song from the 60s or the 70s and certainly the 80s, I know it's that decade, right? And I can tell in a second, whether it's whatever kind of, there's just certain sound qualities that those records have that you can identify, synthesizers or just the way like early Beatles stuff sounds really kind of tinny and different. And yet I was at dinner multiple times the past year with friends and we would hear music coming over at the restaurants and I couldn't tell you like if that song came out 3 years ago or 12 years ago. And I think that music's really, it's becoming harder and harder to tell those differences. And I was wondering if you guys had the same kind of feeling that, something that came out, there's a big difference between 1964 and 1974 in terms of the way this music sounds. And yet, I don't know that the same can be said between 2014 and 2024.
It's tempting to agree with you actually, but I'm very aware of the fact that my knowledge of stuff made in the last 5 years is nothing like as extensive as my knowledge of stuff made in the 70s or the 80s or whatever. And it's possible to a 15-year-old, they may sound as different as, as a record made in a punk rock record and a record made in the late 80s. I don't know. But what you do know is that records nowadays, for the last 30 years, they're made in a certain way. They're made in the box, as they describe it. They're made using Pro Tools. They're made on a laptop. They're engineered in a particular way. In that they're less to do with people actually playing in a room and more to do with moving blocks of sound around.
Right.
So you tend to get things that sound very dense. Yeah, well, there's some of that. There's certainly it's
the same Pro Tools or whatever, isn't it?
Yeah. But also, I'm always very struck by the fact that if I'm ever anywhere near a recording studio, whatever nowadays, they do a lot of production and so forth. It's kind of done visually. They're looking at the screen, and they're looking at, they want to build it up to a certain density, and they want it to be full.
Which is interesting, because the temptation is just to put in sound that you wouldn't normally have had there, because you can see there's a space. There's a space, you feel you want to fill it, but people didn't think like that before when they couldn't see the track.
Right.
But I think also, just one other point, I think there's something to do with our understanding of context. A lot of that's to do with, again, it's the music press disappearing. I think that, you saw everything as a chronology. You understood that came before, but before that, my kids have grown up without kind of music press, really. And so they're not particularly bothered about what influenced what came first and what order things appeared in. And I think that's, we don't necessarily have that idea of context anymore. You just hear a record and you don't immediately put it in a particular moment in time.
Yeah.
But I think it's also the case that if you took any cultural product, if we can use that expression, whether it's telly or a movie or a record, nowadays, at some stage in its making, there will be 10 people gathered round a screen with varying degrees of power. They just will. Uh-huh. And some of them will say, can you move that bit to that bit? Wouldn't it be better if all that bit, they're inside the process, whereas they never used to be. It was finished and it was delivered to them, and there was nothing you could do about it. Whereas nowadays, not just nowadays, last 30 years, they bring people in. What do you think of this? And also, music is, by its very nature nowadays, it's all provisional, because any hit record has 10 different mixers, doesn't it? It's not like you've done it. There it is. Don't mess with it. You kind of mess with it forever, don't you? But it's funny. You were talking about that business, the records from certain eras, sounds that came from certain eras. But we're only talking this morning to Mark Blake, who's a writer who's just written the book about Fleetwood Mac. And one of the things we were saying is the great thing about Fleetwood Mac, which probably accounts for their continued popularity, that they don't really sound as if they come from the late 70s or the 80s or whatever. You take a Fleetwood Mac record, you plonk it next to a Taylor Swift record, and it sounds completely...
really contemporary.
Really contemporary.
Yeah.
You don't agree?
Well, some of those 80s Fleetwood Mac songs sound very 80s to me, with the synthesizers, etc. Just because that was the times, and I get it, but... I think more than late 70s stuff, I think would sound a little bit more contemporary. But I think that's, there's always a cyclical thing. But I don't know. Certain sounds, I think I just associate with a decade, and yet the last 10, 12 years.
Yeah, the syndrome.
The
syndrome from boo, boo, whatever it was, 1987.
Somebody ought to invent a piece of software which can just remove syndromes from records. Otherwise, blameless records from the 1980s. Because there was a time in the 1980s when if they had a new trick, everybody pulled it, didn't they? Everybody thought, we can do that sound, therefore they did. I suppose it's like in 1960.
Right on time. It's that, and the Cher single, was it Believe? That kind of.
Well, it was whatever you call it. Well, what was that thing called? That was based
on auto-tune?
It was called something
it
else.
wasn't auto-tune. Auto-tune was making you sing in tune if you can't sing in tune. That was just a little thing that swiveled the vocal back, didn't it? It repeated it.
Yeah.
I don't know what you call it.
But it's only like in 1967, after the Beatles had done Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, every album that came out had at least one track that had that sound on it, because everybody discovered the button on the desk that allowed you to do that. And it kind of made anything sound kind of, weird, and therefore you'd get away with it, in a way that you might not have done previously. But it's an interesting point, and I don't know if it's ever going to change, because Nobody's going to uninvent technology, are they?
Nope.
I mean, although, I don't know, you never know. People may start doing things in a totally different fashion. But, well, look, an interesting point. And glad you've brought that to the campfire. And no doubt it'll provoke some.
We've warmed our toes on it.
Yeah, there you go. Well, thanks very much for doing that, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.
Belated happy birthday on your birthday.
Happy birthday again.
Thank you so much.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.